At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists have spent decades convinced they had uncovered humanity's first temple, built nearly 12,000 years ago by Stone Age hunter-gatherers. Official timelines, radiocarbon numbers, and famed experts cemented this extraordinary claim. But subtle cracks have emerged, layer inconsistencies, unexplained erosion, and repeating patterns that don't fit the story we've been told. If the biggest secret of Göbekli Tepe has gone unnoticed all this time, what does that mean for everything we think we know about the birth of civilization? To answer, we need to start with the timeline everyone believes. Charcoal fragments, animal bones, and traces of ancient mortar, these are the materials that anchor Göbekli Tepe's timeline in scientific fact. In laboratory after laboratory, samples from the site have been subjected to radiocarbon testing, producing a series of numbers that form the backbone of the official chronology. One of the most cited results comes from Enclosure C, where a charcoal sample labeled UGAMS 100797 returned a radiocarbon age of 9,700 years before present. When calibrated, this places the construction between 9,270 and 9,130 BCE with more than 90% probability. A second set of measurements, drawn from the humus layer above layer 2, produced an age of 8,800 years before present, calibrated to a range of 8,220 to 7,590 BCE. This sets a clear upper limit for activity in the later phases of the site, showing that use continued for centuries after the first stones were raised. In Enclosure D, a sample taken from wall plaster containing organic material yielded a calibrated date between 9,600 and 9,300 BCE, reinforcing the idea that the earliest monumental construction began in the mid-10th millennium BCE. These numbers are not isolated. Additional samples from Enclosure A, including animal teeth and charcoal, consistently fall within the late 10th and early 9th millennia BCE. The pattern is clear. The oldest parts of Göbekli Tepe were built around 9,600 BCE, with later activity stretching well into the 8th millennium. The margin for error is small, often less than a century, thanks to advances in calibration curves such as IntCal 20, which refines the conversion from radiocarbon years to calendar years using tree rings and corals. The timeline is further sharpened by Bayesian sequence modeling, which incorporates both the stratigraphic order of the layers and the radiocarbon data. This approach confirms that Enclosure D is the oldest, followed by C and then A, with each phase building on the last. The 8-phase construction model, favored by many researchers, fits the data tightly, sequencing the enclosures from about 9,650 to 9,000 BCE. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who led the first systematic excavations, once described Göbekli Tepe as the world's oldest monumental religious sanctuary, a claim grounded in these very numbers. Every date, every laboratory code, every sliver of bone or charcoal is a piece of the puzzle. Together, they underpin the story that has defined Göbekli Tepe for decades, a site built by hunter-gatherers thousands of years before the rise of agriculture, standing alone at the dawn of civilization. Spread across the arid hills of southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe covers more than 22 acres, an area larger than many later Bronze Age cities. Even today, with only a fraction revealed, the scale is staggering. Over 200 T-shaped limestone pillars have been identified beneath the surface, each weighing up to 20 tons and reaching heights of 5.5 meters. The tallest pillars loom over the central spaces of the enclosures, their tops level and squared, their sides carved with reliefs of wild animals, lions, foxes, boars, vultures, rendered with a clarity that suggests both skill and intent. The labor required to quarry, transport, and raise these monoliths is difficult to overstate. Limestone had to be cut from bedrock using stone tools, then dragged hundreds of meters across uneven ground. Pillars were set into sockets carved directly into the limestone floor, ringed by low stone walls. Some enclosures feature as many as 12 pillars in a single circle with two larger central monoliths dominating the space. These arrangements are repeated across at least 20 known enclosures, most still buried, their outlines mapped by ground-penetrating radar. From the first season of systematic excavation in 1995, the sheer magnitude of the site challenged assumptions about what hunter-gatherers could achieve. No evidence of pottery, no traces of domesticated plants or animals, only stone tools, wild animal bones, and the monumental architecture itself. The absence of domestic debris led Klaus Schmidt to a bold conclusion. In interviews and publications, he called Göbekli Tepe the world's oldest temple, a phrase that quickly spread through academic circles and popular media alike. This label did more than describe stones and carvings. It recast the site as a turning point in human history, a place where ritual and belief took precedence over daily survival, thousands of years before the first cities or written language. The narrative of the first temple became inseparable from the site's physical reality. The numbers, 22 acres, 200 pillars, 5.5 meters tall, served not just as statistics, but as proof that something extraordinary was happening on this hilltop nearly 12,000 years ago. As Schmidt put it in a 2007 interview, here at the very beginning was a sanctuary built by people who had not yet learned to farm, but who already knew how to dream. Lee Clare walks the perimeter of Enclosure D, field notebook in hand, as sunlight catches the edges of a pillar's carved relief. He pauses, tracing a fingertip across a faint groove, one of hundreds that crisscross the limestone. Under magnification, the surface tells a story of repeated contact. Shallow chisel marks, some clean and sharp, others worn and blurred by time. The limestone's grain is interrupted by scars that run at odd angles, suggesting more than a single episode of shaping. Microscopy reveals stone tool striations consistent with flint blades, but also a patchwork of micro-pitting and abrasion, evidence of exposure to the elements before burial. Sediment samples from the base of the pillar contain a jumble of silt, ash, and compacted organic matter. Thin section analysis shows layers of wind-blown dust trapped between construction debris, hinting at periods when the monument stood open to the air. In some places, the lower faces of the pillars display a faint patina, a mineral sheen that forms only after years of contact with rain and sun. The tops, by contrast, remain raw, their edges crisp where they were protected by backfill. Stratigraphy complicates the picture. Inverted layers appear in the fill, with older sediments capping younger material, a reversal that suggests backfilling was neither straightforward nor immediate. Claire's notes record the odd placement of animal bones and burnt seeds, some pressed deep against the pillar's base, others scattered in upper fill. The pattern points to periodic cleaning, reuse, and perhaps ritual deposition rather than a single abrupt burial. Erosion on select pillars is uneven, with one face deeply weathered and another nearly pristine. This asymmetry, combined with the sediment record, challenges the notion of a single-phase construction and burial. Instead, the evidence suggests cycles of exposure and concealment spanning generations, a sequence written in stone, sediment, and the silent language of tool marks. Nechi Karl stands over a digital tablet, tracing his finger along a map that reveals what lies beneath the surface of Göbekli Tepe. For years, only the exposed enclosures A, C, and D hinted at the site's complexity. But as ground-penetrating radar swept the hilltop, a new pattern began to emerge. The subsurface echoes mapped out more than 20 enclosures, their outlines forming a web that stretches beyond the visible stones. Each circle or oval is anchored by pairs of T-shaped pillars, and their positions are not random. Statistical analysis shows that the distances between central pillars repeat with uncanny precision, as if the builders followed a measured grid. Carul's team charted the alignments. Enclosures B, C, and D form the points of an equilateral triangle, their centers separated by nearly identical spans of stone. The same geometric relationships appear at Karahan Tepe and Sefer Tepe, two sister sites in the Tas Tepeler region. Across the plateau, the orientation of each enclosure's entrance clusters around the southeast, matching the rising point of the winter solstice sun at the time of construction. Pillars carved with foxes, wild boar, and serpents face the same direction, their motifs repeating in sequence from one ring to the next. This is not the scatter of temporary shelters or the chaos of a single burst of construction. The spatial order suggests a blueprint, an intentional plan that spanned generations. The placement of each pillar, the repetition of animal symbols, and the measured gaps between circles point to long-term coordination. Carroll describes the site as a networked system, its architecture echoing a shared logic that connects not just stones, but the people who shaped them over centuries. In the quiet of the excavation tent, the evidence on Carroll's screen hints at a secret written into the very ground, a design too consistent to be accidental and too ambitious to have come together by chance. Moving a 20-ton pillar across rough limestone slopes demands more than determination. It requires planning, coordination, and a steady supply of hands. Archaeologists estimate that to carve, transport, and raise a single monolith at Göbekli Tepe, at least 50 to 70 people had to work together, often for weeks at a time. The site's largest circles contain up to a dozen of these pillars each, arranged with such precision that the central stones stand perfectly upright, their broad faces aligned to cardinal points or solar events. No evidence of wheeled vehicles or draft animals exists from this era. Every block was cut with stone tools, then dragged overland using ropes, levers, and human muscle alone. The logistics go further. Feeding and sheltering a labor force of this size, even for a short season, would have required stockpiles of food and water, resources that hunter-gatherers typically carried only in small quantities. Yet the animal bones and grinding stones found scattered among the enclosures suggest large-scale feasting and food processing on site. Some researchers calculate that raising all the exposed pillars would have taken tens of thousands of work hours, spread over years or even decades. Others point to the repeated architectural patterns across the Taz Tepeler region, hinting at a shared knowledge base and the ability to transmit complex plans from one generation to the next. Traditional models of hunter-gatherer life struggle to explain this level of organization. Small, mobile bands rarely gather in such numbers, let alone sustain coordinated construction on this scale. The evidence at Göbekli Tepe points to something different, a society capable of mobilizing hundreds of people, managing resources, and executing architectural visions that would shape the landscape for centuries. The stones themselves pose a quiet but persistent question. Who were the people who built this place, and how did they learn to work together on such an ambitious scale? Peer-reviewed journals, grant committees, and conference panels, these are the engines that keep archaeological research in motion. At Göbekli Tepe, the official timeline has been shaped as much by these institutions as by the stones themselves. For decades, the dominant narrative held steady, a monumental sanctuary built by hunter-gatherers around 9,600 BCE, a claim reinforced in textbooks, museum exhibits, and international press releases. Behind the scenes, however, the process of challenging this story proved anything but straightforward. Securing funding for fieldwork at Göbekli Tepe often depended on proposals that echoed established interpretations. Grant applications stressed the site's role as the world's first temple, a phrase that appeared in reports to the German Archaeological Institute and Turkey's Ministry of Culture. These agencies prioritized research that would attract international attention and boost cultural tourism. In 2018, when UNESCO added Göbekli Tepe to its World Heritage List, visitor numbers surged and state funding followed. The economic incentives for maintaining a clear, marketable narrative grew stronger. Academic journals, too, favored consensus. Papers that reinforced the 9,600 BCE construction date and the ritual function of the enclosures moved smoothly through peer review. By contrast, manuscripts that questioned the sequence of construction or proposed alternative readings of the stratigraphy faced lengthy review cycles and requests for more data. Anonymous reviewer comments, preserved in university archives, reveal a pattern. The evidence for extended occupation remains inconclusive, reads one. Another notes, the established chronology is robust. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Policy statements from officials echoed this caution. In a 2022 address, Culture Minister Mehmet Nuri Ersoy praised the site's contribution to Turkey's cultural identity, highlighting its role in national heritage and economic development. The pressure to align research with these priorities was subtle but persistent. As a result, alternative interpretations, however well argued, often found themselves sidelined, waiting for new methods or dramatic discoveries to shift the debate. For years, the stones at Göbekli Tepe told a single story, not because dissent was absent, but because the machinery of academia and tourism rewarded agreement. A timeline stretched across centuries, not decades, would force a reckoning with everything assumed about the birth of civilization. If the monumental enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were shaped and reshaped over generations, the site becomes more than a ritual landmark. It becomes evidence of a society in transition, caught between worlds. The scale of organization needed to sustain such an effort year after year hints at structures far beyond the reach of small mobile bands. Coordinated labor, resource management, and the ability to transmit architectural knowledge across time suggest a community with deep-rooted social bonds and shared memory. Archaeologists now debate whether the people of Göbekli Tepe were truly hunter-gatherers in the traditional sense. Grinding stones, storage pits, and traces of repeated occupation point to a population experimenting with new ways of living. The lines between forager and farmer blur as evidence mounts for feasts and gatherings that required stockpiled food and long-term planning. The site's complexity raises questions about the origins of hierarchy, leadership, and belief. If monumental construction began before the first domesticated grains took root, then the story of agriculture and settled life may need to be rewritten. Some scholars, like Lee Clare and Nekmi Karul, argue that Göbekli Tepe stands at the threshold of the Neolithic, not as a sudden leap, but as the product of gradual change. The repeated architectural motifs, the careful sequencing of enclosures, and the presence of both ritual and domestic features suggest a society negotiating the demands of a new era. This reimagined timeline reframes the site as a laboratory of human adaptation, where old patterns collided with emerging possibilities. The consequences ripple outward, challenging the narrative that farming and permanent villages were prerequisites for complexity. Instead, Göbekli Tepe hints at a world where belief, cooperation, and shared vision came first, casting doubt on where and how the story of civilization truly begins. Today, Göbekli Tepe still resists a simple story. As new discoveries surface, the debate isn't just academic, it challenges how we define civilization's origins. Each unanswered question exposes the limits of what we know and what we want to believe. The stones remain silent, but our search for their meaning continues. What do you think lies beneath the surface? Share your thoughts below.